Gunther, can you see everybody?
I can, yes. I have a good panoramic view.
Okay, well, welcome to our seminar here at Harvard
Thank you.
Institute for Learning and Retirement. And
It's a pleasure to be here to join you on this. So,
we're excited to have you here because we've been studying a part of your history and Harvard's history for the last going on now 11 weeks. And you're a major part of that early period at Harvard studying psychedelics and what is now becoming quite almost, I won't go so far as to say mainstream, but it's getting to be a palatable topic without being classified as a radical.
well, it's earned commercial interest. So, and in this country, that seems to drive a lot of conversations. Anyway, yes.
Well, as you know, I gave you access to what we've looked at, so I'm happy to know that you've seen some of the materials that we've covered.
Yes, I've gone through it in depth, and I want to say at the outset, I want to give a shout out to Ed for the depth and breadth of the research, the scholarship. It's so comprehensive and so much detail. I really appreciate what you've done there, and I just want, as I said, I want to give you a little shout out at the beginning of this event today to honor what you've done with that. It's really first rate.
Well, thank you very much, and I just want to say that these young folks behind me have kept me on my toes. So, my work has been to keep these guys, interested.
Well, I have fond memories of Cambridge. I lived in Cambridge from 1960 to 89. Most of the time was spent on Avon Hill Street. I had a lovely home there on the corner of Upland Road and Avon Hill, and partook of the many opportunities in Cambridge and Boston area. And my children and grandchildren still live in the area, actually, in Needham and Dedham. So I have occasion to visit occasionally, although in recent years with COVID, I haven't been traveling that much. Anyways.
Well, I want to say that we were excited when I first reached out to you, and I want to thank you for your reception of my cold call. But there was a period of time then before you had a little bit of a bout with some of the medical issues you were dealing with, that you were actually going to attend in person here.
Yeah. Yes, I actually had considered that and would have combined it with a trip to visit my family, but it didn't work out that way. I had what was a serious automobile accident, and then another fall at home, which created a fairly severe case of TBI, which I'm still dealing a little bit with that. And it turned out that the basis for all of that was that I needed a pacemaker. So basically, since July, I've been in a healing mode, pretty much. Although I'm as you can see today, my vitality is coming back, and I'm still vertical and reasonably lucid. So
You look very
happy
good.
to do.
You look very good. I thought I'd jump into our first question, and I gave you a little preview of what I wanted to start with, and it really starts with the person of Timothy Leary, because a lot of our discussions, and through the period of 1960 through probably 1974, his persona became in my estimation, almost a caricature, because he played to the media, he played to the camera, he played to the news, he played to that. He was a showman. He also, in later years, called him a kind of a showman philosopher. So one of the things that's really crucial, at least for me, and I think some of the group, is in the early period from 1959, when you came in from London and came to Harvard, worked with Henry Murray, and in the early days when everybody was still in the Brooks Brothers suits, your first impression of Timothy as a person, as a character, could you comment on these early, before the showman showed up?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to. Timothy, I was assigned to Timothy. He was my faculty advisor. I didn't know who he was. As an undergraduate at Kenyon College, I majored in psychology and philosophy. I didn't have a lot of exposure to the type of research that Tim was noted for in the field of psychology, which was personality assessment. So when I came to Harvard in 1960, in the fall, I had spent the previous year in Europe, in Norway, on a Fulbright fellowship. So I was able to delay my admittance to Harvard for a year because of that Fulbright. I had a meeting with Tim, which is normal in the fall. The summer before, I had arrived in Cambridge the summer before and had worked with Harry Murray as an intern, doing basically some relatively menial coding work on the TAT, the thematic apperception test that he developed, which is very well known in the field of diagnostic psychology. So I had a meeting with Tim in what turned out to be like a utility closet on the first floor of what was appropriately named the Center for Research in Personality, but it had a very interesting connection because the street was Divinity Avenue, actually, at 5 Divinity Avenue, which I didn't recognize at the time was probably a bit of an omen, if you will. But anyway, I had this meeting with him in what had been a converted utility closet, because it turned out he really didn't want to be. He wanted to be closer to the students and closer to maybe to the front door of the building. But anyway, I found him to be very present, very charming, very intelligent, a really good listener. He was very engaging, and he said to me at the very beginning, I want you to know something, Gunther, that this past summer, I was in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and he told me the story of taking the mushrooms there and his experience, and that it was quoted publicly as saying, I learned more about psychology in that 5-hour session than I did in all my professional years. And he said, that's what I'm interested in now. He said, I'm really no longer that interested in what brought me here originally, or why Dave McClellan brought me to Harvard. My focus going forward, these are my words, not his, I'm paraphrasing. I'm interested in the exploration of consciousness and how these and related substances can actually help the field of psychology to go much deeper than it has in the past. And he said, if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to be your advisor, take you on. If not, both of us would be better served by your working with someone else. And I, kind of raised my hand and said, sign me up. I'm happy to join you on that. And so I've shared a little bit of this online and in different interviews and things, but my background prior to that was that for a number of years, I mentioned going to Kenyon College. I had been exposed through my family culture to music, and my father was a pianist and a classically trained violinist and a psychologist. And so I grew up with classical music in my home almost daily through FM radio. And I got interested in jazz early on. And one thing led to another, and I discovered bebop and jazz and the beats in the 50s. So I kind of identified with that, social movement. And I was exposed to cannabis when I was 15, 16 years old in Milwaukee. With my dear friend who passed away a number of years ago now, Mike Melvoin, who became a real fixture in the Los Angeles musical scene. He was the first working musician to become head of NARAS, the National Academy of Recording Sciences. So he and I would go to jazz clubs. So I was exposed to jazz culture and black jazz musicians and therefore cannabis. So I had some experience of altered consciousness, if you will. But of course, nothing like what I was about to experience a week or two later when I had my first psilocybin experience. But coming back to your question, my first impression of Tim was pretty much what I said a few minutes ago: charming, intelligent, present, attentive, interesting, cultured. It was what was not to like, if you will.
Well, I understand that he was a very attractive and charismatic person.
Yeah.
And so the other person involved with this research was Richard Alpert, who
Yeah.
the Bostonian world and development. So could you comment a little bit on his early persona as he later turned into Ram Dass?
Mhm. Yes, well, Richard, again, I met Richard after meeting with Tim. It was just a matter of time because the group was coming together. I met Ralph Metzner. Excuse me a moment, please. I met Ralph Metzner and George Litwin. And so the three of us were the three graduate students that were the core of that group. And then I met Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass, in that same short period. And again, I found him to be very, very charming, very intelligent also, and very warm. He had more of an emotional, I would say at this point, from my current perspective, more of an emotional center than Timothy. Timothy was much more mental, cognitive, intellectual, and it's not that Richard didn't have that. He certainly had that in spades as well, but he had a bit more of an evolved emotional capacity, a little more heart-centered, if you will. And of course, later on, when he became Ram Dass, that manifested itself in his basically taking on the role of what is called a bhakti yoga path, a path of devotion, basically. And so I could see the antecedents of that early on as I'm reflecting on it now in terms of what I'm describing as his emotional capacity. So, and actually over the years, I stayed in closer touch. I stayed in touch with Tim over the years as well, but I stayed in closer touch with Richard and Ram Dass. Met him numerous times in different situations. At one point, actually, I had moved to a lovely bungalow down in Cohasset, and it turned out that Richard was living in Cohasset, taking care of his father, actually, his father was living there. So then I saw him in another situation in San Diego, where he ministered to my wife at that time, who was dying of cancer. So I saw him on a number of different occasions, and we developed a friendship. We actually developed a friendship early on, and then of course, later on in life, when he was in Maui, my wife Ellen and I would frequently, almost every winter, would take a trip to Maui for a few weeks, and we would spend some time with him there and reminisce and have interesting dialogues. I think, one of the few, if not the only person from that early part in his life that maintained a connection with him, a consistent connection. And so I didn't have a relationship with him as a teacher, as a guru teacher. My relationship with him was as a friend. And I think we both appreciated that. Someone in that position of being a teacher guru, often it's very difficult to maintain friendships with people kind of in an ordinary sense, because you're subject to being put on a pedestal. There are a lot of projections, psychological projections that happen. So having the opportunity to interact with each other and sharing some stories and then reflecting on what was happening in psychedelics currently and other things, as well as very deep discussions on human spirituality. It was a wonderful relationship. He passed away now a few years ago.
So,
But again, early on, again, what I mentioned is that he had a reputation actually at Harvard. He was voted. He had only been there a year or two actually. He had come from Stanford, and he was considered to be a kind of very bright, shining kind of new shining presence, if you will. And he he was voted the most popular instructor actually in an undergraduate course he was teaching, because he had that charm, he had that wit, he had that seductive capacity, he had the capacity to identify with people in terms of his own psychodynamics, which later on in his role as a teacher guru, he actually would utilize that. He would utilize the kind of everyman story, if you will. I'm like you folks. I'm raised in this Jewish family in Newton, Massachusetts, and and all the kind of generic humorous, Jewish neuroses and things like that. That a lot of stories and you know a lot of jokes, a lot of comedians play on. He had that ability. He had that ability early on. It was manifest in his teaching at Harvard, and then that became part of his repertoire, if you will, as a teacher, as a guru later. So that his influence, which was massive on the culture, in terms of a generation or more of people, being kind of exposed in his book "Be Here Now" and so on, and many talks and lectures and visits to places that he influenced. Probably many of you right now here were influenced by him. And part of that was the sense of what I say is the kind of everyman, that appeal, if you will, to the ordinariness of and the kind of humor of human neurosis, and how we end up creating these neurotic patterns, which slowly but surely tend to suffocate us, if you will, unless and until there's some kind of opening.
Right.
And that opening can take many, many different forms. And the psychedelics are just one of a number of ways that can happen, in my opinion.
So I know both of them had a bit of a showman quality. I remember Richard going down to the East Village at some point in time and playing on the comedy stage. But I want to go back to Divinity Avenue, because right down and stay at the period of time in the beginning, because this is, from this perspective in 2023, I want to really get the roots of this whole evolution of this phenomenon of consciousness and various chemicals that excite the nervous system and also other parts of the psyche. So down the hall was Richard Schultes, who was a botanist who was in Oklahoma in 1936, sent there by his botany teacher. And how much of a connection? And I want to get a sense of the community around your five Divinity Avenue center. So down the hall, I mean, and you got Emerson Hall right down there, and
yeah.
So
well, I remember going to the Botanical Museum, attending a small seminar that he gave. He and Tim had a bit of a relationship. He was an interesting character. He was very tall and somewhat stoic, fond of wearing like dark navy and black suits, very formal, very Yankee. He had a really strong kind of Yankee vibe, and he would play that basically. He was a different person when he went into the jungle. It was a completely kind of a different personality shift. It was like a multiple personality. You had that capacity to take on an identity that was needed in whatever environment. So he had a little bit of a standoffish quality in that regard, but he was a very interesting man. And so I didn't really know him. I only saw him on a couple of occasions, and I mentioned one occasion on a small seminar in the Botanical Museum, which was down the street from 5 Divinity Avenue. So when you're asking me, Ed, about the circle of people, so I would describe it as a kind of a series of concentric circles. So, at the center you have, for want of a better word at the moment, kind of the so-called esoteric circle, which were the five of us, basically, which were the core.
Can I ask you one thing about Frank Barron? He was temporarily brought here by Timothy and David.
Yes.
He's part of this initial onslaught because he
Yes.
was the only one who had any, if I'm not mistaken, of the faculty. He's the only one who had any experience prior to Timothy with the mushroom.
Well, George Litwin turned out actually had experience with mescaline, and George was a graduate student. So, but he and Frank carried that torch, if you will. But I didn't mean to leave him out of the core. It's just that he was there for a year, or less than a year, and I would see Frank as more functioning in a catalytic function around the group, particularly at the very beginning, in terms of basically, turning Tim on to this possibility. And also, in a very interesting way, having a lot of political savvy around what he advised Tim to do. He was one of a number of people that advised Tim to take a different approach, if you will, later on, which he didn't listen to. I was one of those people to one of my teachers, one of my spiritual teachers in the Gurdjieff work. And I can tell you that story a little bit later today if you want. But right now I want to focus on your question. So have I answered that part of your question around Frank?
That circle is a good place now to start with that inner esoteric.
So we have the kind of esoteric core, and I'm using esoteric here, not in the esoteric sense so much as more of kind of the moment-to-moment, day-to-day, the people that had a big stake in the game, a lot of flesh in the game, if you will. So there were five of us, basically. Then around that, there were other graduate students, Ralph Schwitzgable, Sarah Kinney, David Kolb, Alfred Altschuler, a number of different people that went on to become very successful in their careers in psychology and other areas. And they interacted on occasion. Okay, they certainly partook of the psychedelic, particularly of the psilocybin experiences in the first couple of years, and then played some role in some of the research. I remember Ralph and Sarah co-authored an article along with myself and Ralph Metzger and Tim on the psychedelic experience. So there was that, that circle, if you will. You could call it again, for want of a better term, maybe the mesoteric circle, but and people would come and go into that circle. And then, of course, there was the broader circle of the so-called, what I'm calling here, the exoteric circle, if you will, that had to do with all the players, the faculty, the students, the administration, the medical people, that whole chorus, if you will, that whole group of people that interacted with us in different ways. And I would include in that people that would come in actually to take the psilocybin experience with Tim, and that included a lot of people like Allen Ginsberg and jazz musicians. I think Dizzy Gillespie, and later on, I actually had a psychedelic experience with Charlie Mingus, which was interesting. And Arthur Kessler, the author, came to have a session with Tim. Many artists, a lot of people, a lot of artists in the social scene in New York were coming up to Cambridge and coming from all over the world, at different times.
So one of the early challenges is how to get this particular chemical, the mushroom, and then it was synthesized in 1958 by Albert Hoffman. But you had access. You somehow George Litwin found out that it was up the block, so to speak.
Yes, well, it was actually quite easy. Tim corresponded with Albert Hoffman and made a request, and a week or two later, the psilocybin pills arrived in a little bottle. I can still visualize the the little pyramid on the bottle, which was part of the label, which was the kind of their brand image, if you will. And so each little bottle had, I think, maybe 30 tablets of psilocybin synthesized that he had done, and it was really very easy to order that.
All completely new.
It was completely legal, and of course, there's the Harvard imprimatur, if you will, and and the research model that was being proposed, which was basically I would call it more of a kind of anthropological, if you will, or taxonomic approach to research, which was attempting to identify the content of people's experiences from many walks of life, from business people, artists, musicians, engineers, scientists, political people, and people in the entertainment business, from all walks of life and all ages, if you will. So our research in the first year or so was focused largely on capturing their experiences. Everyone went through it, was required to write a short essay on their experience. That was just part of the agreement for it. And then we did a fair amount of content analysis, stuff, that activities, if you will, activities that normally would be associated with doing what in psychology is called content research, if you will. And that was our focus.
And part of the early criticism down the hall, in the laboratory, you have B.F. Skinner with the rats and the experimental psychologist and the kind of, scientific, if you will. And the early criticism of your work, if you will, was that you were not scientific enough. But you tried, you really did try to work in that model.
I mean, one of the things with psychedelics is that so-called double-blind experiments don't work that well. It's pretty obvious immediately, or within the first 20, 30 minutes, what's happening. And it was too early for us to start thinking about doing a so-called double-blind. Later, we did a bit of that in the prison project on the Good Friday service, where some of the participants received a so-called placebo. And of course, the theory of placebo is very interesting because it involves the mind and what the mind creates, so that's a whole conversation we could have around placebo theory and its relationship to consciousness. But basically, we were attempting to do the kind of, I'm calling it more anthropological research, sociological type of research, based, or you could also call it, from a different perspective, phenomenological research, basically, which is a tradition in European psychology that existed for a long time. And there were a few examples of that in the Western field, but you have to remember that in terms of the history of Harvard and the psychology department, which was in a different building, which was based on psychophysical measurements. So you had people like Stevens and Skinner and others, that were really focused on psychometric measurement, if you will, psychophysical measurements. So there was a long history. And of course, with Skinner, you had the operant conditioning model. So when the Department of Social Relations was created, part of the effort behind that was to create a different approach to psychology that would be, less focused on working with mice, if you will, or rats, or conditioning theory, but would be part of a fabric of an interdisciplinary model that would include sociological and anthropological and political science and other disciplines that would interact in a very mature interdisciplinary model, which was the idea behind it, a brilliant idea at the time. So there was a kind of a bit of a defensiveness, if you will, or a need to prove that we are a science. And this is something that the field of psychology has struggled with for ages because of the so-called sister sciences of, physics and chemistry and biology, which were, considered to be true sciences, even, from many perspectives, economics was not considered to be a science, but a bit of a pseudoscience. So psychology kind of fell into that kind of poor science model, if you will. And so part of the need there over years was to kind of prove that we are as good as the measurement people, that we are as good as the behaviorists, that what we're studying and what we're focusing on is as important, if not more important. So there was a bit of, I would say, kind of built into the DNA, a little bit of a kind of defensiveness. And so what we were doing in terms of exploring phenomenology, in a very classic way, which is what in a way what Freud had done and what philosophers had done, and certainly in the area of Oriental medicine and Oriental philosophy, was a tremendous tradition of phenomenology, of exploring consciousness through meditative states of awareness, in which time would slow down and things could be seen much more objectively. So we were part of that tradition, and it wasn't long before we recognized through reading, of starting to read Buddhist and Vedic and Taoist texts and other spiritual literature, that we began to see that, and other literature, particularly the literature that comes out of the field of mycology and so on, we began to realize that there's a whole history here of the use of these substances to create states of consciousness in which the possibilities of human development can be witnessed, can be seen, can be experienced, actually. Although be it in what I now see as a kind of simulation, if you will. It's a simulation of the real thing, and by calling it a simulation, I'm not lessening it. In fact, I think it's an extremely important window or threshold or portal for people who otherwise might not be inclined to have that kind of be oriented in that way.
Well, you tried very hard, because you're working with that experiential typewriter and all these other forms of mechanical mechanisms of research, but you were also discovering a level of the psychological, mental, emotional body of the person was way beyond what was in the early 20th century we're speaking about here, way beyond it. And so you were trying to capture a dimension of the person that was far outside the common understanding of the academic psychology. Now, simultaneously to this, on the West Coast, a lot was going on. So I want to bring in the larger culture, not only of the United States, but also of Harvard itself, because now you have undergraduates, you have graduate students, you have people who have experienced various substances that have expanded their limited, if you will, understanding, and they're wanting to come to you, Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, you guys at Divinity. You're now spreading your research outside the quote unquote scientific world. Now you're in you're in houses, you're in kind of living rooms, you're playing music. You're now into a kind of amorphous outside scientific research. So tell me a little bit about the attraction that you started to draw, much to your dismay, I think, in the later.
Well, everything has its place in that, especially from a rearview mirror. But I would say this, that the excitement, the curiosity, the sense of being on the cutting edge of research in human consciousness, particularly, again, as I said a few moments ago, about as we started doing readings and things, historical readings and different spiritual texts and so on, and we began to see that we were part of a larger fabric, if you will, and introducing that into Western psychology, with a tremendous amount of excitement. And so, for example, there were a lot of graduate students who wanted to work with us, and that created a certain level of disconnect or envy on the part of other faculty in the Center for Research and Personality, because there was so much excitement and genuine curiosity, and the feeling I had, and particularly the core group, and for other people as well, and I would say in both the exoteric and mesoteric circles that I mentioned earlier, there was a sense of being part of something that was really significant and very contagious, and so it, in what would be otherwise the citadel of Western rationality of Harvard University. Here is this movement towards recognizing non-conceptual awareness as an important field of study of consciousness of human beings, and the role of non-conceptual awareness. What I'm calling here, it can be called many names in different contexts, but what I'm calling here at the moment, in the context we're speaking here, of a non-conceptual awareness, of discovering the importance of that, and how that is the kind of DNA, if you will, for real creativity, for real compassion, for real, for true spirituality, for many different aspects of human potential lie in this capacity, which is for the most part overridden by the conceptual mind and the conceptual brain, and what is called more and more now in neuroscience the kind of default mode network, which is basically the neurological basis of the sense of self, of the ego structure, which gets dissolved temporarily, if you will, through psychedelics. It allows a kind of neuroplasticity to occur for a period of time where the conceptual mind is suspended, if you will, and as I'm saying, this non-conceptual awareness arises and starts to inform many different aspects of human beings. So again, we saw ourselves as part of a historical movement that had every capacity to impact human life. And bear in mind, this is the early '60s, so we have the Vietnam War, you have the beginning of the women's movement, these revolutionary and evolutionary movements that are happening, and what we're doing at Harvard there, and also what was happening on the West Coast in a parallel fashion at SRI, at Stanford Research, and I'm not talking about Ken Kesey right now. I'm talking about other people on the West Coast that were exploring also in their own way, with more of a therapeutic focus than we had. But anyway, this was the zeitgeist of the time. So the psychedelics fit beautifully into that, if you will. So that created a reaction, if you will. I mean, I'm getting maybe a bit metaphysical here, but I would say, that I don't really have to get metaphysical. I would say, even from the standpoint of physics, every action has a reaction, right? So it's basically yin-yang theory, if you will, Chinese yin-yang theory. So when you have a very powerful affirming force around the psychedelics, it will naturally create a denying force, if you will. That's just the nature of dialogical thinking, if you will, or of basically of duality, if you will. It has that yin-yang aspect. So if you have a very powerful initiating affirming force, there's going to be a denying force that arises. And what has to happen in that context is there has to be a reconciling force that balances the two, and it creates a third force, if you will, and that creates a harmony of yin and yang, which until it becomes imbalanced again, can sustain a certain level of personal development or social or spiritual development. And I don't think that reconciling force was available to us at the time, if you will.
Well, one of the balancing forces, or at least trying to balance, is David McClellan. He was the overseer of your research, and he was trying to keep you on the planet, so to speak. So could you tell us, because we have some people here who know him personally, had worked with him.
Yeah.
Could you speak?
Well, David was in a tough spot. He had invited Tim to Harvard. He had met Tim in Italy. Tim had been his Tim's wife had committed suicide the year before, and Tim was there with his two young children. And it was in Florence, I believe. Frank Bannon was there as well. And again, McLeod was impressed by Tim's research on the multi-level diagnosis of personality. Timothy had written essentially the book on that subject. Was very advanced at the time. I mean, really advanced at the time, taking into account the social fabric, the psychodynamic fabric, the relationships, many different aspects of multidimensional aspects of personality, and measuring those with an instrument that was state of the art at that time. So that was really impressed McClellan, and I think David saw that what he was buying basically, but that's not actually what he ended up with.
No.
So,
He did. I have to give him that much. He had his own Quakerism. He had his own experiences, and
yes.
To that. But moving on with the research, you're now expanding your new centers. You're having a house. Ramdas his house. Richard has his house. You graduate students. All you guys are commuting in this network of Cambridge. The university is starting to get wind of this. Timothy goes to Copenhagen at 61. Now he upsets the European Psychological Association. They think they set back psychology 25 years. He comes back. LSD comes into the picture. That changes things.
Yes, LSD ended up being a catalyst for another level of consciousness, if you will. You know, the psilocybin experience for most of us pretty much stayed within the structure of a fluid ego. Okay? An ego that was experiencing what I described earlier as a certain level of plasticity. So there would be openings, for example, that would be manifest in, for example, the sensory experience, the sense of visualization and that's why so many artists, for example, were intrigued with mescaline and psilocybin because of the visual dimensions of it, also the auditory dimensions, if you were a musician and so on. And again, I was kind of trained that way in terms of my auditory sense also. So, but it stayed within I would say, the domain, if you will, although again, with a lot of plasticity and flexibility and creativity within an ego structure. LSD changed that. LSD actually moved us outside of the ego structure. It was dissolving of the ego structure into what might be described more as and is described in the historical literature as cosmic consciousness, if you will, or also described in some traditions as a causal level, as compared to, let's say, the etheric level of consciousness. So that it was a different dimension, a completely different dimension. So in that dimension, there was very little motivation to do research in a formal sense. Again, because it was so powerful in terms of moving out of out of the structure of the ego, but the collective ego as well. So that was my experience, and so I think at that point the focus on research really shifted. The research model and the variety of programs that we did, including the Concord Prison Project and the Good Friday service, and all the individual sessions that we conducted. I think we conducted maybe close to 300 or 400 sessions with people, including ourselves, collect that data, and then writing about it and publishing it. But all of that kind of shifted. And what happened is this character was sort of like a character out of a Thomas Mann, like a Felix Krull type of character out of a Thomas Mann novel. Michael Hollingshead shows up in Cambridge and writes a suicide note to Tim, and gets Tim's attention, and because Tim's heart of compassion opens for that, and he ends up meeting with Michael. Michael has a mayonnaise jar of LSD, basically, mixed in with, I don't know what the additive was, I don't think it was mayonnaise, but crystallized sugar maybe. And turns out Michael had come from London. He had taken LSD and psilocybin and other things like that in London. The story was that he had turned the Beatles on to LSD, that he claimed to have been psychoanalyzed by Anna Freud. There were a lot of stories. He was very witty, very British. He really played that role to a hilt. Very smart, also, and funny and seductive. And so he turned Tim on to LSD, and Tim described that at one point that he felt that he was like one of for like a 24, 48-hour period, he felt he was one of like Conrad Lorenz's ducks in an imprinting phase of kind of following, Michael around, basically. So Michael was a complex character, somewhat sociopathic, psychopathic, in my opinion. Uh, I had a friendship with him, but I was able to maintain a distance and didn't get burned by him because I was able to maintain a proper distance from that. But he played a major role in bringing LSD into our circle there. You know, now just to give you a comparison of what we were doing versus, let's say, what the establishment was doing, and by establishment, I would include the CIA in that. For example, there was a psychiatrist in Boston. You mentioned this in your curriculum materials, named Max Wrinkle. Okay.
Right.
And also another, famous doctor, Henry Beecher at the at Mass General. So I was in touch with both of them. Max Wrinkle requested a meeting with me at one point. I went to visit him, and he was at the Mass Mental Health Center, or or Boston Psychopathic. I forgot, the names have changed over the years there, but he turned out to be a CIA grant to study what was called, a different word was called psychomimetic, psychosis mimicking drugs. So what he was attempting to do was to see if he could create psychosis in patients or clients, so they could study schizophrenia, they could study, paranoia, if you will. They could study these different, classifications through the lens of the psychedelics. So he took me into, for example, his research area, and it was like a hospital room with fluorescent lighting and cots, steel cots, and a lot of humming equipment. And this is where his patients, or the experiment, the clients in the experiment, the volunteers would be. They would be literally laying on these metal cots in a white room with bright fluorescent lighting, with doctors with stethoscopes and smocks and medical equipment running, and he would get what he was looking for. Naturally, it was set and setting, if you will. The setting was basically a hospital setting. The set, or psychological expectation, was that we're creating a model psychosis. So that was he was about. Meanwhile, we were working in people's living rooms with stereophonics, with mandalas, with Indian prints, with incense, with images, with storytelling. It was like a completely different worldview, basically. So you asked me earlier about the kind of conflict that emerged. There was also what I'm addressing now is the kind of conflict of worldviews, if you will, that relate to scientific investigation and how human beings are viewed within that context. Okay? So ours was much more naturalistic in affirming the human spirit and attempting to study how these drugs, or particularly psilocybin in its instance, could actually enhance a human well-being, if you will, and creativity and conflict resolution and elements of, again, that was not our major focus, although I had an interest in that early, given my training as a therapist, in how it could impact, for example, healing of neurosis. I never saw much potential for it in the in terms of treating psychosis. But I saw and still see a vast potential for working in the area of normal garden variety neuroses, and certainly in the area of trauma.
Right. I wanted to ask the group, I want to continue on with this, but I wanted to ask the group if they had any questions for
Yeah,
Gunther.
Gunther, I've heard you talk about this yin-yang relationship, within the science world. Well, one of the most important yin-yang relationships that struck me was the one between Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. And because you got to know them on the level that you did, I thought it'd be very interesting to have you talk about how they developed their relationship and how you saw the differences between them, and how it seemed like Richard Alpert in some way tried to emulate Timothy Leary. And they had very complementary qualities, but very different also. I mean, so
Yeah.
just open that up. You can talk.
Sure, happy to do that. I've remarked on that before in different contexts, different interviews. Thank you for that observation and the question. Yeah. Now let me start with Tim. Tim was, in my opinion, in my experience, that shaped my opinion, and in turn, my opinion shaped my experience, was cut from a cloth of sort of like a Black Irishman, if you will, Brendan Behan, an Irish poet, alcoholic Irish poet, basically. Tim had challenges with alcohol, a lot of his life until the psychedelics came along. So he was impulsive. He was very anti-authoritarian, or what he would view as anti-authority. If you read his biography, and you saw the instances in his life when he defied authority and got punished for it, whether it was at West Point or later at Harvard or later with the Nixon administration, or at many different choice points, if you will, in his life, there was a point of conflict with authority. And that authority could be left, right, or center politically. I mean, he had as much trouble dealing with Eldridge Cleaver in Algeria when he was on the lam than he did with the warden at the prison, basically. In fact, at one point in a little book that he wrote called what was the title? It's called Confessions of a Truth Fiend or something like that. It's one of his smaller books. He describes being on the lam in Algeria, and where Eldridge Cleaver, from the Black Panthers, was also basically in exile, and he being used by the Algerian government as part of their larger propaganda campaign. So Tim basically ended up being, he self-described himself as in parole, where Cleaver was his parole officer. So again, Tim didn't care if it was left, right, or center. If anyone was imposing their will on him, he would have a real strong reaction. Very, very willful himself. Again, very strong sense of individuality. Also highly creative. So, for example, my first session, psilocybin session with Tim, the psychiatrist who was the Concord prison psychiatrist, Ralph Metzler, my wife at the time, and a couple other people. Tim, at one point in the middle of the session, stands up and begins to pace in the living room and starts quoting verbatim from Finnegan's Wake. And he's inside the character. Now, I've tried to, I'm in my early 20s. I'm trying to read Finnegan's. I can't even read a paragraph. I just can't relate to it, And he's inside the character. So that was his creativity. My mouth dropped. I mean, in the middle of the session, to see the creativity, the engagement, the capacity, right down to to the semantic and tonal elements of the narrative, that he had. He had really stepped into it, almost like a method actor, if you will. So he was the initiator. And I used the model earlier of the initiator, the denier, the reconciler. Tim was the initiator of all this stuff. And Richard got caught up in that because it actually attracted and magnified his own visionary capacities and his own Richard's own creativity and a deep desire to become known, to make a difference, for example, which was a big motivator for him early on. And he was a lot younger. Richard was just 2 or 3 years older than I am. I'm 87. Okay, so he was a couple of years older. So they played like, I described this years ago, they played like the Jewish mother and the Irish father, basically. That was the family dynamic. And
Great.
Richard was the responsible one. Richard handled the finances. Richard handled raising the money, including his own and his family's money. Richard basically was doing most of the kind of logistics and mechanical and clerical and organizational aspects were his. He had a great gift for that. He had a capacity to be very organized. Jim had this incredible creative capacity, but not that well organized, And so a lot of, again, the attraction to for example, a Finnegan's Wake, which is a flow of consciousness, a stream of consciousness. Jim could easily, because of the fluidity of his own ideation, he could step into that very easily. So it was a good match in terms of yin and yang. And it worked for a lot of years until some point, with all the external pressure at Millbrook, with the G. Gordon Liddy raid on Millbrook, which is a whole backstory in relation to the Nixon administration and how, the role of the psychedelics in terms of the Nixon administration, and particularly through G. Gordon Liddy and the plumbers and Watergate. There's a whole backstory there I have some familiarity with. But that was the dynamic, basically. Again, the Jewish mother, the Irish father, and it worked very well for a long time. My own role in that actually manifested at one point early on. I think it was my 4th or 5th session, something like that. We had a session at Richard's apartment, or his small home in Cambridge. The 5 of us were there, basically. Maybe Michael Kahn was another, maybe joined us for that. But we had the experience of the kind of where Tim became Christ and we were the disciples, basically. And I found myself playing the role of Judas in that psychodrama. So, but I had an exposure to a different interpretation of Judas, actually, which is not in normally part of the Judeo-Christian or Christian narrative, which has cast Judas as the villain in the Christ drama. There's another interpretation which comes from a more esoteric circle that Judas actually was the most devoted of Christ's disciples and took on himself the approbation through an agreement with Christ that basically he would betray Christ and that he would play that role historically in order to if you will, to create the victim identity, which they foresaw as a kind of necessary metaphor, in order to propagate the religion. So there's a whole different kind of interpretation. So I was, as a nice Jewish boy from Milwaukee, who comes from a Holocaust family background. I was born in Nazi Germany in 1937. We got out, my parents and I got out, I was 2 years old on one of the last boats from Hamburg. My father was imprisoned in Buchenwald for a month, arrested on Kristallnacht, got out because he had French papers. He was born in Alsace-Lorraine, following the Treaty of Versailles, and therefore had French papers. So my mother went to Gestapo headquarters, actually got him out by showing his French papers to the Nazis. They kicked him out of Buchenwald, basically, and a month or two later, we left Germany. So I had that background. So having this background of the kind of again, this kind of ethical Jewish mentality, which I inherited, from my tradition and from my parents, especially. I was raising questions earlier on around what we were doing. And that night in particular, I prior to my having an out of body experience, I actually was raising questions about, are we really looking at this through the lens of multiple generations, sort of like what has been known, in more recent times of the kind of seventh generation model of the Iroquois nation, where the elders of the tribe would actually, before they would make any major decisions, would, through their prophetic and oracular capacity, would look ahead 7 generations to see what the impact might be of a decision they would make at this time, what the multiples of that would be. So I was raising questions like that, and they weren't being very well received, if you will, because that, again, was not part of the chemistry of that moment, if you will. So that's the role I played. I call it a Judas role because, again, I was speaking truth to power at that time, if you will. Although being part of the power, also part of the clan, if you will. I was raising those kind of questions, and that's partially, I think, when eventually when things fell apart. I was given a teaching appointment by Abraham Maslow at Brandeis, who was interested in psychedelic research. He didn't take, to the best of my knowledge, he didn't take psychedelics himself, but he was very interested because he was working on what he called at that time peak experiences. He had gone beyond the kind of Maslow hierarchy of needs model and was starting to study, again, transcendental experiences. Very interested in that. And of course, we were in the business of creating them on a weekly basis. So I happened to be a good candidate for a teaching position at Brandeis. And so he happened to be the chairman of the department at that time, and expended some political capital, particularly given what was going on at Harvard. But he offered me a teaching position, which I took, and my family, my parents were delighted. I was delighted to be, a nice Jewish boy working at Brandeis with Abraham Maslow. So I lasted a year there before I resigned my position and moved to join Tim and Richard Ramdas, and or later to be Ramdas and Ralph Metzer at Millbrook. And that's a whole other story because I didn't stay there very long either, because I had my own oracular experience there, which suggested that I needed to come back and just become an ordinary bloke again. So I did that. And at that point, that, again, part of my own background was that it led me to leave the psychedelics and all of that whole gestalt, if you will. Yes, sir.
So any next question?
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for giving us your time to talk to you. It's really wonderful.
Happy to do so.
We've talked a lot about the tension between traditional psychology and traditional Harvard and the kind of work that you were doing, where you have science and measurement and objectivity on one side and subjectivity and phenomenology on the other side. But now we're in this new era of psychedelic research, particularly on psilocybin. And I was wondering what you thought about that. Do you feel like somehow objectivity is won and subjectivity is lost? That you have all these white-coated scientists now who are looking at psilocybin? Are you?
I think there's some really interesting dynamics happening now, and and it'll be interesting to see how this evolves. What I mentioned this earlier in a little bit of a kind of negative way, maybe around the commercialization aspect. Remember, I started earlier, I talked about that. And what I'm seeing now is that there's so much interest in the mainstream psychiatry and pharmacology and related areas because there's a recognition that the existing, antipsychotic drugs really don't work very well, at all, if you will. I mean, they're very, and they have a lot, again, in the earlier area, had a lot of really bad side effects, even now. So there's a deep wish, a deep desire to just come up with a magic pill So one of the things that is being explored right now, and this is driven to some extent, to a large extent, by the commercialization and the need for patents and so on, is you have scientists and physicians, for example, the MGH and other places, and this is actually actively going on now, who are trying to develop a psychedelic drug without psychedelic effects. Basically, they're trying to remove the experiential, aspect from the 5 to 6 hours, let's say, of psilocybin, or particularly with LSD, or 4 or 5 hours of psilocybin, because that model is not scalable from a commercial standpoint in terms of Western medicine. So, especially when it's costing $4,000 or $5,000, $6,000 for a session, you can't scale that. So what's driving that right now is, can we remove, by moving a few molecules and creating a new patent, can we remove the experiential aspect, which is viewed through that lens as a negative side effect, or at least a incidental side effect that gets in the way because it's too time consuming. So that's what's driving a lot of, I would say, some of the research right now, again, which is on the biochemical level. There's a lot going on. I particularly like the work that's going on with PTSD and working with veterans. I happen to know a number of people that are closely involved in that. I've advised one of them, who's a colleague of mine, a dear friend here in Boulder, Colorado, he's working with special forces, basically introducing a meditation and Qigong program based on an attempt to integrate the experience that these Navy SEALs and other special forces who are highly traumatized. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. There's a strong commercialization factor. I was amazed the impact that Pollan's book had on mass consciousness, and how it's almost as if there was like a building up of a need, basically a subliminal need that triggered. And of course, one could look at the current economic, political, social system that we're in, the chaos, basically, the climate change, all the things that we're all living through now. And one could maybe make an argument that from an evolutionary perspective, that the psychedelics being re-emerging now could play a role in healing, perhaps. That may be naive. I had a little bit of that view early on, because back in the day, in the 60s, when we were doing this stuff, we had Richard Nixon, we had the plumbers, we had the Vietnam War. So we had our own version of the kind of chaotic system that we're living in now. And so we saw, again, as I said earlier, we saw the psychedelics as possibly being an agent for change in that way.
In
So
the early days, it seemed very magical in many respects, those early days. And now it seems as if the magic has kind of been sucked out of the whole thing. And while it might still have applicability to help people in various ways, if the magic's gone, I wondered if you had a sense of that.
I don't know. I haven't thought about it that way. I'd have to think about that a little bit in terms of the magic. Certainly the mystery has diminished. But I'm struck by how many just really ordinary people are interested in this topic. I'm talking about people like Uber drivers and ordinary people that I encounter day to day in the supermarket or here and there, who are exposed to this, who are curious about this. And maybe they haven't, pulled the trigger on it, but there's definitely, again, there's this, again, I have to shift metaphors here, but let's say from a Vedic perspective of the dance of Shiva, the goddess of creation and destruction, she's dancing harder than ever. And with all of the turmoil, all of the chaos that we're experiencing right now, there is also an evolutionary movement arising here that is opening up a level of spiritual understanding and compassion that I believe is parallel to the involutionary movement that's happening. So these things always happen together. It may not be so visible, the timing may be a little bit because one thing may be an ascendant at a little bit more at a certain point, but I'm seeing over the years from my current perspective, more and more interest in opening up human potential in healing and in getting past the kind of classic patriarchal and, kind of warlike mentality, if you will, the violence and the conflict, the competition. I think there's a growing sense that we got to go beyond this, basically, if we're going to survive. We're in a period of, where I think it's happened many times historically, when there's a concatenation, there's a combination of geophysical events, of climate change, of human consciousness, of war, of violence, of weaponry. It's happened before, and it just there are periods of time we go through historically when these kind of situations arise, if you will, and the potential for spiritual understanding increases exponentially at that time. Yes, Ed.
Thank you. So I just wanted to follow up with something you said a moment ago, and that is about the development of the pharmaceutical with the goal of separating out the experiential from some other aspect. Isn't the experiential the goal of using these kind of products? So, I mean, besides having fun, I'm using
Yeah.
maybe.
Well, from my perspective, absolutely, it is through the experiential domain of this that one encounters, one's belief structure, one's conditioning. If people who've had this experience, or who kind of accept that lens of perception, what perhaps has happened in past lives, multi dimensions open up when the plasticity of the nervous system, when the existing default network is lifted. And that is through the experiential aspect of it, of encountering and reliving the emotional body, the healing of the emotional body. So yeah, to me, it's a central aspect of what the healing potential is. And to remove that, to turn it into like in a way, it's almost like microdosing is an example of the use of psychedelics to feel better. Okay? Which is okay, but I'm more interested in the truth. And if not feeling so good is part and parcel of learning the truth, I prefer I'd opt for that, if you will. Okay, and when I'm talking about feeling better, I'm not talking about like chronic suffering, neurotic suffering. I'm just talking about being able to face the demons of your own conditioned patterns as you go through the psychedelics and come out the other side of it. I remember once, for example, given my Holocaust background, I had a reliving of a Holocaust experience, including the ovens, all of it, and I was so shaken by that. I went up to Tim after the session. I described what was. I was still impacted by the session coming down, but I was able to speak, and I shared with him what had happened in that session. And he looked at me and he kind of smiled, and he said to me, he shook his head, he said, "Gunther, I've been on both sides of the gun. I've been on both sides of the gun." And that was like a Buddha teaching, if you will. That I received that with like an immediate understanding of the kind of karmic dimension of my own life and the experiences, and how we can be in one episode we can be the victim, and another episode we're the aggressor. And again, from a Buddhist perspective, we've lived many lives and have played all those roles. So that's a different level of understanding. That doesn't come through a microdose or through a magic pill, if you will.
Very different, very good.
Thank you. Maybe this is a little outside what we're doing here, but I'm very interested in your work and what took you there with Qigong and Tai Chi and other areas that are not affected by.
Yes. Well, as you could imagine, those early experiences opened me up to a variety of influences. As I said earlier, we were doing a lot of reading in different traditions and discovering, for example, in the classical Greek mysteries, and certainly in the Latin South American cultures, and including the Celtic tradition, many traditions. All of them actually seem to have at some point or some dimension of the psychedelic awakening, if you will, or some kind of possibility. And I happened to stumble on the Gurdjieff work at that time. Ralph had been attending a meeting in New York of a Gurdjieff group, because when we had read a book by P.D. Ouspensky on the Gurdjieff work, he describes a conversation with Gurdjieff where they're talking about substances that can be used to provide an experience for human beings of their potential, and that the risk and benefits, if you will, the risk reward ratio that it tends to those experiences in terms of how they need to be understood and used or not, and not misused. So, but Tim seized on that basically, and I did as well. And so I became interested through Ralph, who turned me on to the fact that our teacher, Mr. Nyland, had worked with Gurdjieff himself, who was in his 70s at that time, was in New York City. So I went to New York often to go to his groups, and then discovered that he actually had a Boston group, and I became part of that. So the Gurdjieff work was my first introduction to formal spiritual teachings, and I stayed with that work for about 10 years until Mr. Nyland died, and then I began to study other things such as Taoism and Buddhism and Vedic studies and non-dual Advaita studies, which I continued to study and practice. I was turned on early to the martial arts. So, for example, I studied Okinawan karate when I was in Cambridge with a teacher, an American teacher who had spent a lot of years in Okinawa and was the first to bring that form of karate to the U.S. I studied Aikido in Cambridge in an Aikido dojo in Cambridge with Kanai Sensei, who had worked with Uyeshiba, the founder of Aikido. And then I was starting to be in my 30s, and I just couldn't handle some of the physicality of the Aikido and karate. So I became interested in Tai Chi, and I took a very deep dive into Tai Chi, which I continue to practice almost daily and have for close to 60 years. And part of that exploration was also the Qigong aspects. And, those practices helped me in spite of, some of my recent challenges at 87. I'm in pretty good health. My core health is quite good. I've led a holistic life for many, many years. Again, most of that, if not all of that, not the details per se, but the understanding of that came through the early psychedelics. And so we became interested early on in all kinds of alternatives. I remember Michio Kushi, the founder of macrobiotics. There was just an article in the New York Times about him. And I was one of his first students. I remember being in his living room in Cambridge. He and his wife would hold these little seminars. There were like 5 or 6 of us eating macrobiotic cuisine that she would cook. And he would lecture on yin-yang theory from a macrobiotic perspective, And so fast forward, this article described a grocery store in LA, in Beverly Hills, called Erewhon, which actually the earlier version was on Newbury Street in Boston years ago. And that's become the hottest grocery store in Hollywood, right? So with like $15 shakes, if you will. So anyway, I got turned on to that early, and I've been influenced by my spiritual work for many years. I've never had an issue of a conflict between my ordinary life and my inner life. Basically, largely on the Gurdjieff work, in which ordinary life is considered a laboratory in which to exercise spiritual muscles. It's not a monastic tradition.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So
when I was a little kid, I'm reading all this stuff about how bad psychedelics are and all that. You know, I'm like 8, 10 years old and all this. And this is something that I brought into my life. My son said, well, yeah, he told that to me and all that. And his course has kind of changed my perspective. So I was just wondering if in real time, when you saw all that happening, you know, with the demonization of psychedelics and stuff, whether you saw this like kind of as a train coming and what you thought you could do about it, or what caused it?
Yes, thank you for that question. As I mentioned earlier, I was describing the role of Judas. I think I had a sense of that. I had a prophetic sense that we were heading down the wrong path, or that we needed to add a more sustainable scientific operational model to house the work after Harvard ended. But even before that ended, I had a sense of that. That's what led me, for example, to arrange a meeting between Timothy Leary and my teacher in the Gurdjieff work, in which Mr. Nyland, my teacher who had worked with Gurdjieff, he liked him. He liked Tim's spirit. He liked his rascal nature, his independence. And he said to Tim, and I was there in the room with the three of us there, and he looked Tim in the eye and he said to him, what you're doing is really important. This is really important research, but you're going about it the wrong way. You've got to create a better institutional framework for this in order to really gain the benefits for it. But Tim wouldn't listen to him. At that point, Tim was, he was getting beaten up from all kinds of quarters. And again, that interacting with his own nature, which I described earlier, led him to just basically take a, for want of a better word, a kind of fuck you attitude to any authority, if you will. So, and bear in mind, at that time you had the Nixon administration, you had where Nixon said Tim was the most dangerous man in America.
Right.
Can you imagine that? I mean, the most dangerous, because he was the Pied Piper, basically seducing the youth away from what Eisenhower described as the medical industrial complex, basically.
Yeah, you talk now about Timothy Leary and he was taking the wrong approach. And we read about all this going off the rails pretty much with Andrew Weil and when it flashed into the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. But did you have a sense before that whole thing that it was going off the rails, that this was going to be a finite moment and it was going to be gone?
I did. As I said before, I had that sense, and I think that was maybe when I played the role of Judas that night, that was informing that. And as I said earlier, that's what led me out of the movement. Also, I gave up a prestigious teaching job at Brandeis with Abe Maslow to go join my colleagues in Millbrook. That we were being funded by the Hitchcock family, which was a part of the Mellon family fortune, in a 40 room mansion estate, a 3,000 acre estate in Millbrook, New York. And I was there with my family and my 2 young children, my daughter Rachel, my son Michael, who were 5 and 3, my wife at that time Karen. We sold everything, loaded up our station wagon, and moved to Millbrook. And here we are in the middle of this kind of chaotic, psychedelic scene, which turned out to be not a good place to raise children. And also, my wife was very unhappy there, and it wasn't like she was like a square. It's just that, again, it was not a healthy place to raise children, and it was just too much chaos. And I had a dream one night. I had a lucid dream, prophetic lucid dream, in which I was in front of in a cosmic ray chamber with a giant kind of like wheel, like a ship's wheel, with a gauge. And my task was to open the shuttlecock of the cosmic energy coming into the room to keep the needle on the red line, but not go over the red line, the red line, if I went over the red line, I would be cosmically fried, if you will. My brain would be fried, or I would be like, it would be like a suicide pact. So, but staying on the line was the high, if you will. Staying on the line was where the energy was. So it was like a kind of almost like a scene out of Deer Hunter, kind of like a famous scene where they're playing Russian roulette. So I, as I was having that experience, I was I was interpreting it in real time because I was awake in the dream. It was a lucid dream. It wasn't a Jungian dream that I had to interpret later through symbols. The symbolism of being in that chamber and going through that experience was clear to me that what I was doing with my life. And so the decision to leave, I made a decision that same moment to leave. So it took us about a month to be able to pack up the wagon and go back to Cambridge, and I had to start my life over again. Basically, I had professionally, I had to take a few jobs here and there, kind of contract jobs in a couple of nonprofits to do some psychological work. I worked on a project where we were actually testing out the use of sonar for blind people, using an embedded sonar chip in a cane, basically, a very early version of that. So I designed the project around that. And then I was given teaching positions at Boston College, later at UMass Boston. And but I had to basically, start my life over again, raising my family. And that's when I basically kind of dropped out of the psychedelic scene for many years. I've only gotten back into it in this recent period when I'm kind of exploring again a little bit of psilocybin, a little bit of MDMA. I want to clean up any residual traumatic elements that I haven't addressed, and I want to kind of prepare myself for a peaceful death. So that's what I've been working on, very infrequently, and just here at home. We live in the mountains outside of Boulder, very quiet, very peaceful. It's a very good set and setting to do the exploration again. And I'm very comfortable. It's like riding a bicycle. You never forget, if you will.
I'd like to ask you about one of the exoteric participants, Lisa Beaverman. How do you see her role as scold, as disruptor, as helpful, or as irrelevant?
So I missed the first part of you saying. Are you asking me a question?
I'm asking you about one of the exoteric participants, very much on the sidelines, not one of you five.
Yeah.
Lisa Beaverman. First of all, I don't know if you remember her, and second,
I remember Lisa. She was our office manager for IFIF.
yeah, she was.
Yeah.
But she was often at odds with some of the directions, particularly that Tim was taking, and I wondered how you'd seen her role.
I found Lisa to be difficult.
Yeah.
I don't know why. She seemed very negative a lot of the time, and some of it was directed around the work we were doing, but I think it had more to do with her own psychodynamics, in which the work just became a vehicle for the expression of her neurosis or her anger or unhappiness. So she also always seemed to have kind of a shadow over her. That's I haven't thought about her for years. I saw her name listed actually in the bibliography for the course, and that she had actually written a book or an article based on. I haven't seen that, and she didn't work with us too long, but I don't know who. Again, I don't remember who hired her or how she came aboard. Basically.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to an interesting setting. You talked a little bit about the work with the Concord prison experiment. And that seemed to be such a terrible setting to be working, with people who are incarcerated, right, with the goal of helping them to understand the decisions they made in their life, how they could go about changing it. So why don't you reflect on, what you thought were the positives that could come out of it, and if there's any implications of, where it could be used therapeutically in a better setting, as PTSD is being looked at working with psilocybin.
Understand. All right, let me tell you a story that will, I think, answer your question and maybe add some more color as well. So I had a session at Concord Prison where I was working with a convict, an Irish mafioso convict, Jimmy Kerrigan. His brother, John Kerrigan, was on death row in Walpole. And Jimmy and his brother John had been criminals almost their whole life, from childhood on, had been incarcerated many times. And these guys were violent criminals. I think they could have easily been hitmen. They could have, played multiple roles in criminality. So he was one of the volunteers in the program. And we had cops in the room, and we did our best, for example, in terms of the setting. We tried to bring in, this was in the hospital ward of the Concord prison, which is at the back of the prison and through the courtyard in a lockdown area. It's a hospital ward, if you will. And we were locked in there from 8:30 in the morning till about 5 in the afternoon with a guard at the door, on the outer door. And, with 12 convicts, if you will, 8 to 10 to 12 convicts at different times. And so we brought in Indian prints and we brought in some incense. The incense lasted about 5 minutes before the guard knocked on the door and told us, because they thought we were smoking pot in the room or something. I don't know. So, but we were able to maintain the Indian prints. So we had a semblance of setting, but we had to kind of override the setting with our own set, our own expectation, if you will, our own presence, awareness. So I'm sitting there working with Jimmy Kerrigan on the bed. And his eyes are shut and he's catatonic. He's not moving. He's not responding to anything I'm doing. And I'm a pretty good guide. I'm pretty experienced. So I wasn't pushing myself on it, but I saw how, he was rigid, holding himself rigid, and really not just laying there quietly, but there was a rigidity. I saw a lot of suffering there. And so I was doing my best to facilitate some healing. And he just wouldn't respond to me. So I finally just gave up, and then I went to work with someone else. So 2 weeks later, we reconvened, because that was our pattern. We would do one session. 2 weeks later, we'd come back and do a shorter debrief. We went there the whole 5 or 6 hours. And I was debriefing with him. And at that point, he was lucid. He was a bit carefree. He was joyful, interacting with me. And he shared with me what he was experiencing. And he said to me, Gunther, I went into what the Tibetans would call a bardo state, a state of a delusionary, hallucinatory state, in which I felt that you guys were giving me a truth serum. You were giving us like a sodium pentothal or something like that, and we're trying to find out the crimes that I had committed, I hadn't been busted for. And I was planning to have you executed. I was thinking about how I could have you executed by my compadres on the outside. And we both kind of looked at each other and laughed, because it was so outrageous, It was so as I think about it now, what allowed me to actually laugh at that, was some understanding, But then fast forward, a couple of years later, the project's over, and I get a call. I'm in my office at UMass. A number of years later, I'm at my office at UMass, and I get a call. It's Jimmy Kerrigan, and he said, I'm out, and on parole, and would you be willing to see me? I said, sure, come on by. So it was after hours. He came by. And then he shared with me, he said, Gunther, I got to tell you, I'm on the lam. Actually, I lied to you earlier that I'm on the lam again. I'm going to be leaving the state. But I wanted to reconnect with you one last time. And tell you that the experiences that we had those years ago were really important to me. That I've never committed a violent crime since then. That I couldn't really change my life. And that's a whole other story. We tried to create a 12-step program for the convicts based on Synanon that didn't work because it was way ahead of its time. But he shared with me that those experiences, those transcendental, experiences that he had were like very powerful and very instrumental in him changing from a violent criminal to kind of just a petty thief, if you will, again, because that's what he knew. He knew how to make a living doing that. And we embraced, and he left, and I never heard from him again. But there was a meeting of the heart mind there with him that, and we had that experience in different ways with different convicts in the program because, they really became extremely vulnerable and very open during those few hours together. I had another experience there, personal experience in the hospital ward when I was one of the guides, and I was sitting there like starting to speak, and I got into kind of a visionary messianic mode of speaking, and I could see, for example, like how the hypnotic trance that I was creating in the group through my ideation and my, the pacing of my speech and so on. And suddenly I had a visual, I visualized myself as this giant spider creating this web where all the people in the room were caught in the web of my cognition. And I suddenly saw that what a control freak I had become in that moment. And I felt a deep sense of shame and a deep sense of dishonesty. And I fainted. I swooned. It was so powerful. The next thing I know, I wake up, I'm on my back on one of the cots with a sea of faces looking down at me. I can see it now as clear as day. Like I'm laying there looking up and I'm seeing a circle of heads looking down at me. Of course, there's Tim and there's Ralph, but there's like a bunch of the convicts too, who are genuinely concerned about my well-being, really heartfully concerned about my well-being. So, some remarkable experiences at the level of, of being to being, of a heart connection with people outside of their economic, social, political roles, if you will. In this case, the role of the convict and the Harvard professor or graduate student. Those roles dissolved in those 5 hours, basically. And, and we did the best we can to facilitate healing and change. Later on, we did a research project.
Gunther, I just want to bring your attention. We're getting close to the end, and I do want to finish here. And I know there's.
Well, this is my second question, so if anyone wants to ask you a question instead of me.
I'll go after.
No, you go first.
Okay. Hey, Gunther,
All right.
wondering, when you talked about the 7 generations, because that's part of my culture. And so I'm wondering, where is there a place at the table being that so much of what's being done now comes from that culture for the people who that's been a part of their practice? So you have a special perspective being that you were in this with Harvard when they brought it to the mainstream, and how do you see your role, what you've seen, where we're at now, and how you can bring in these people to the table as well? Well,
I have some knowledge of an affinity for First Nations, and one of my closest friends from that period of time, Dick Katz, moved to Saskatoon, teaches at a First Nation college there, and over the years I've done a lot of retreats and sweat lodges and ritual work. So I have the deepest appreciation for that, also a recognition of many of the challenges that Native Americans have with respect to alcohol abuse and drug abuse and economic challenges. So, and yet I think one of the issues that has prevented deeper work with psychedelics in terms of the healing potential for Native Americans is because of the history of alcoholism. It's been classified, kind of lumped together, with the normal Schedule I drugs and alcohol, and we all know it's not, completely different. So I know I'm speaking from the knowledge of my friend Dick Katz, who, of all these years, and he was involved sort of in the mesoteric circle that I described earlier. I had a lot of experiences, and we've been really close friends over many, many years from 1960 on. We stay in close touch. And over the years, he hasn't been able to share much around his own psychedelic experience. He married a Native American woman, and he's part of a plan and so on. So he hasn't been able or willing to share much of that because of the history of alcoholism and so on. Again, the things are lumped together. So
I think I'd like to clarify more, like, I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about more about people in research, who have studied that, also studying people, like Maria Sabina, the cultures who have practiced maybe the food.
okay.
So not that, because then it, again, that goes to the exclusivity of academia, where people don't speak with the same terminology and therefore their knowledge is undervalued. So I'm talking more about, like, how do you bring in knowledge that is valuable but presented differently and find
I don't know the answer to that. I don't want to give you a simplistic answer. Again, I think the oracular prophetic traditions are really important. They were really important to us early on in our research, informing how the whole idea of set and setting came out of indigenous cultures, basically. Jim's phrasing, set and setting, which is still used now, and he invented the phrase and the orientation, even more than the phrase, that came out of basically indigenous cultures, where, for example, the use of psychedelics was always predicated on a ritual, on a timing, astronomically, astrologically. Was designed with very specific outcomes in mind. So having that knowledge and wisdom really informed our work earlier. I think there's certainly a residual that's happening now, because set and setting is recognized. People really don't attribute it to him, but he created the phrase. But we're the first to acknowledge where it came from, as I said a moment ago. So how to bring that in to today, I don't know. Maybe people like yourself maybe can bring that in. All right. I don't know. I would certainly, if I were in a position to impact decision making and budgeting or whatever's needed to bring that perspective in, I would certainly support that. But I'm not in that position at this time in my life.
Well, Gunther, I just want to bring it's getting close to our kind of final minute here. And I want to just say, for my point of view, that this has been a delightful and informed and wonderful kind of meeting.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. You are a well-informed and delightful group. I can see you're enjoying this experience with Ed, and I'm happy to add my 2 bits today. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Okay. All right. God bless. Take good care.